Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. Is it any good? Does it save the Marvel Cinematic Universe from its recent downward spiral that really characterized Phase 4 and unfortunately has continued into Phase 5 with the rather lackluster Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania? This is my review. First of all, guys, if you can go ahead and hit that like button and leave a comment below, it really helps with YouTube and the algorithm and all that good stuff. Anyway, spoilers ahead if you haven't seen Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. I think they really needed a big win here. I think they probably will get a decent enough box office performance. Although I was lying in bed last night trying to figure out, will they? Actually, how is this going to go? Because Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania was the first box office sort of failure for the MCU, I suppose, clearly. And recently, even the TV shows and some of the other movies like Wakanda Forever and that sort of thing, they've been just sort of mediocre. And I'm just wondering if there's a bit of audience burnout now and a bit of audience fatigue. I'll put it this way. I don't think this film is worth going to see in the cinema. And yet, it's not terrible. It's not bad. That's the best thing I can say about it. It's not bad. It's kind of like my Optimus Prime impression. It's not bad. So there's a decent opening action sequence with the character of Adam Warlock, and he becomes a decent enough character as the film goes on, kind of likable anyway. There's one scene at the end. Most of the humor in the film is the typical MCU humor, which characterizes films like Ant-Man and like the Thor films. You could copy and paste any of the jokes out of those movies and put them into this film, or vice versa, and they fit right in. Do you know what I mean? Except maybe for some jokes with that are specific to characters like Drax, for example. There was one time I actually genuinely laughed in this film, which was the awkward group hug scene with Adam Warlock at the end. I thought that was quite funny. But generally, most of the humor doesn't actually work. It doesn't really work in this film. There's a few gags, and a lot of it is inappropriate because you're trying to create tension, you're trying to have serious character moments, and then it's totally undercut by the next silly gag that just feels out of place, and it's constantly diffusing the energy that you're trying to build. And this is the problem with a lot of these movies. They're just so laced with irony, nothing can be taken seriously anymore. So the story primarily focuses around the character of Rocket and the team having to save his life. He's seriously injured, and most of the time Rocket, it features in flashback. We learn about his younger years. He was basically a laboratory experiment created by the High Evolutionary who wants to produce this utopia. There's some sort of transhumanist themes in this movie as well. So he wants to create anthropomorphized animals, these intelligent humanoid-like animals. And there's something about Rocket, specifically his intelligence, that is the linchpin for the High Evolutionary's plans. So he has to get his hands on him. So the team is now headquartered on Nowhere, which we've seen several times already. Everyone's there except Gamora, who we meet later on. She's now back with the Ravagers. I never liked the character of Gamora. You know, I said that before. I always found her to be negative and dour and prickly and hostile, and she's just there to basically put Peter Quill in his place, kick him in the nuts, roll her eyes at him. Thankfully, she doesn't kick him in the nuts in this film, but she does push him up against a console. And you have to think about this. The kind of twisted morality of these films. Why doesn't anyone call her out for acting like a violent psychopath? What kind of a message does this communicate? Why doesn't she get locked up for this? Have we audiences become so numb to this kind of thing that we're just fine with ignoring it? She screams at him psychotically, saying she doesn't give a shit about his Gamora. And because no one calls her out for her completely unjustified violent outburst, in my view, this indirectly and casually enables her domestic violence against Peter. But what's really sad is the fact that this isn't the original Gamora. This is the 2014 version that we saw at the end of Endgame, because the original Gamora was killed in Infinity War. So this version is basically from the past. Therefore, she has no memory of her time with the Guardians, and certainly no memory of her romantic relationship with Peter Quill. So Peter spends a lot of the movie pining after Gamora and trying to convince her to give him a chance, while she continues to reject his advances. And the sad thing is, this is basically a giant reset button for a character who actually underwent some decent development. And it feels to me like the only reason she's in the movie is because they wanted to bring back the entire cast. What sort of annoys me is the fact that none of the rest of the characters from the Guardians attempt to try to help him to essentially rehabilitate this past version, right? To try to help Gamora understand that she did have a life with them, that they did become her family. And it's just left to Peter, so they just kind of leave it his responsibility to do this. And by the end, Mantis is telling him, just let it go, because you've always, she gets Drax to communicate this sort of metaphor that you've been jumping from one lily pad to the next, chasing after women. Now it's time to learn to swim. And in other words, he's being told, just look, let it go, whatever, it's fine. But no, this is a terrible, tragic thing that's happened, and it's no different to a loved one having lost their memory, and he's been told to give up on her, which ultimately, that's exactly what he does. They don't get back together romantically, and by the end of the movie, they all go their separate ways. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but they all go their separate ways at the end of the film, and that's the end of the Guardians. And she goes back to the Ravagers, and I found that the saddest thing of all, because that's not who she is. And so we, the audience, are more aware of who Gamora is, what she's capable of, who she can ultimately become. But because the reset button has essentially been hit on the character, it's as though she's lost all those years, and now she's gone back to being who she was before. And that's just not a satisfying conclusion for a character. She's now spending time with a completely different family. But anyway, I think the first half of the movie is reasonable enough, although the action is so breathless throughout the film that it's easy to lose track of actually why the characters are doing what they're doing and why the plot is moving forward in the particular direction it is. So they go to this rather unique place called the Orgosphere, which is it's entirely organic and biological, gigantic facility, and they're trying to track down an override code to disable this kill switch that's built inside Rocket so that he can wake up. And so the only person's character arc that's really developing throughout the film is Rocket, which is fine because he's the center of the story in this one. But everybody else is just getting a few throwaway lines here and there. Nobody's character is really going on a journey outside of that. And so by the end of the film, when the conclusion finally happens, all the Guardians are just standing around and they all decide to go their own way. And it just sort of feels a bit arbitrary because it's not like these decisions had been sort of building through character development moments in the story naturally. Their farewells don't really feel earned. The breakup of the group just feels a bit forced by the end. Now, the central villain, the High Evolutionary, I think the actor's name is Chudwuki Iwuji. Probably not pronouncing that correctly. I think he does a very good job with the role, but the character himself is just a little bit too arch, a little over the top, a little melodramatic in places. His motivations as a character are quite weak. He wants to create these hybridized creatures similar to Rocket. He takes animals, genetically modifies them, accelerates their evolutionary process, and turns them into intelligent anthropomorphic creatures. And then he wants to populate entire planets with these creations and produce the perfect race, the perfect world. And it's just arbitrary. It's like, why? We don't really understand what's motivating him, what's driving this character. I don't know anything about it. And the thing is, I don't really care to, because his purpose is just purely plot driven. It's just the plot requires a villain. It requires an antagonist to be doing things in order for our heroes to have something to fight against. And in that respect, he fulfills his purpose. But it all feels a bit hollow, like he's a cardboard villain. I just didn't really feel any substance behind the character. The film has some decent action set pieces, some decent fights, but a lot of it is also kind of generic now at this point. It's very typical for MCU movies. If you've seen one space battle, one shootout, you've pretty much seen them all. But there is one decent section where they're in a corridor. This is towards the end of the movie, and all the Guardians fight the bad guys together, and it's made to look like it's all done in a oneer, in a one shot, and it's actually very well put together. But in terms of pacing, the film is quite messy, because there are moments where it's very fast paced, just absolute breathless action. And then there are moments like the middle of the movie where it completely grinds to a halt. The middle of the movie just really drags. They go to this planet, Counter Earth, which is like a duplicate of our planet but from the 1970s, and the population is comprised of anthropomorphic animals. None of them speak English, and yet the Guardians go into this person's house and they're trying to ask this woman questions. They're trying to get information on how they can track down the High Evolutionary, and it just goes on, and it's a really slow part of the movie. I guess it's supposed to be funny in places, but it just doesn't really work, and I think they should have found some other way of tracking him down. So the team have to rescue hordes of animals and test subjects who were going to be used by the High Evolutionary to seed a new world, and Drax and Mantis and Nebula rescue some children that were being held captive on the High Evolutionary's ship. Rocket has this near-death experience where he's reunited with his fellow inmates from his childhood, and that's actually quite a very well done scene. Actually, it's quite a beautiful moment in the movie. So there's a few moments like that sort of tug on the heartstrings, and it could be argued that if Rocket had been killed in this film, like maybe sacrificed himself, that would have helped to bring his character to complete closure, to really process any sense of survivor's guilt for his character. But he doesn't die, he survives, and ends up becoming the captain of the new Guardians of the Galaxy. There's a moment then where you think that maybe Peter Quill might die as he's jettisoned out into space and Adam Warlock has to save him. I think Peter's character is genuinely a very likable protagonist and an action hero. He's a very capable leader, but he does tend to run the gamut from being a little bit childish and immature and insecure emotionally, all the way up to being, quite frequently in this movie, large and in charge. So to cut a long story short, like I've said, in the end of the movie, the Guardians decide to go their separate ways, and nothing about their final decisions and the conclusions of their story arcs feels natural to the story. It just feels a bit tacked on. So with Peter Quill, for example, deciding to go back to Earth to reunite with his grandfather, it just feels very out of left field. Gamora goes back to the Ravagers, like I say. Nebula is going to try and build a community on Nowhere and work with Drax to help to raise the children. Mantis's conclusion is absolutely bizarre. She just decides to leave and go off on her own to go find herself. There's a mid-credit scene there where Rocket and Groot and a few of the others, including Adam Warlock and Cosmo and Kraglin, they're in this desert scene, and you can see that they've clearly formed a new Guardians of the Galaxy. So there could be scope there for a mini-series, for example, or if they could bring back Chris Pratt at least, they could do another film. But regardless, even though I don't think it's a great movie, it could have been a lot worse. It certainly works as a serviceable final act for the Guardians of the Galaxy as we've known them. I'm not sure that this film is going to be enough, however, to really turn the tide for the MCU. I just don't think it's strong enough. They needed something far, far better because there's just been too many mediocre movies recently. The only other thing I want to say is the music. I really didn't like the choice of songs in this one. The Guardians of the Galaxy movies are known for having some really great retro pop and rock songs. This time the ones they chose just didn't leave any impact for me, and they even had some more recent ones. The final song, of course, is by Florence and the Machine. The MCU Phase 5 began with two films that are both the third and final parts of a trilogy, Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, and now Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. So those first two movies serve as farewells to those particular film series. Next up is The Marvels coming in November, which I can't imagine too many people are going to be all that interested in seeing. And then next year, Captain America: New World Order, Thunderbolts, and Blade, which, given the current form of MCU films, I don't have high hopes for. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching. Take care, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.